Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
If you've been following the news about Trump's tariff threats, you may have heard the phrase supply management thrown around by politicians and pundits. It's a decades-old government policy. It's one that not a lot of people even know about, and it's one that's often misunderstood. Supply management is also what's known as a trade irritant. It's a trade policy that we have that the United States government doesn't like. And it's something Donald Trump has been talking about for years. Even during his first term, he was complaining about Canadian supply management. He hates it. He says it's unfair, and he says we're treating American farmers terribly.
But Canada is very tough. They're very, very tough to do business with, and we can't let them take advantage of the U.S. They don't take our agricultural product for the most part. We don't need them for agricultural products because we have all the agriculture we need. They don't take our agricultural product for the most part, our milk, dairy, etc. A little bit they do, but not much. We take theirs.
But the Canadian government says it's off the table. They won't negotiate on supply management. Why not? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, what is supply management and why does Donald Trump care about it? I'm joined by the food professor, Sylvain Charlebois is back, director at the Agrifood Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Hello, Professor. Welcome back.
Hello, David.
So, first off, can you explain in as simple terms as possible for us, what is supply management?
Yes. So supply management has three components, okay? The first component is the quota system. And the quota system is managed by provinces. In fact, there are 5 regions in the country, and all 5 regions will have a board, and they allocate quotas based on what we need. So we produce what we need in Canada based on quotas. So we don't really export much. We just produce what we need and we consume as Canadians. And supply management would include what we call the SM5s. So the feather people, as we call them. So poultry, turkey, chicken, eggs, and of course, dairy. And we talk a lot about dairy because dairy is 80% of supply management. So that's the first component. The second component is fair pricing, and that's managed by the Canadian Dairy Commission in Ottawa. That's a crown corporation. It employs about 85 people, and their job is to survey every year to survey dairy farmers. Okay, we're just going to stick to dairy to make it simple. And they actually try to assess how much it costs to produce 1 hectoliter of milk, and that's how we define how fair compensation looks like for dairy farmers. And lastly, the last component are tariffs on imports. So if you are to sell dairy to Canada, any dairy products to Canada, you are exposed to hefty tariffs, anywhere between 200 to 300%, depending of the product. So for example, butter, if you import butter from the US, you have to pay a 298% tariff on butter. So that's why most of the butter we consume in Canada is Canadian.
Right. And on the fair pricing, how does the Dairy Commission do that? Is it by do they set the price that a store can charge? Can you sort of explain how that works?
Yeah, so the calculations are all for farm gate economics. So it's just about fair pricing for farmers. What happens in a grocery store is very different. It's up to the supply chain, really. Grocers will set prices, and of course, processors, by law, they have to buy from marketing boards their milk. They can't import milk from elsewhere. They can't import butter fat from elsewhere. They have to buy from the marketing board. So, for example, in Ontario, you have the Dairy Farmers of Ontario. That's the marketing board. So they sell to Lactalis and Saputo and the people making all the dairy products we actually see at the grocery store. And of course, grocers will buy those products and they set their own prices. But by law, they have to pay the price set by the Canadian Dairy Commission. And so we don't know exactly who is surveyed, and that's been a problem. Transparency has always been a problem in the dairy sector. We don't know how they calculate fair pricing. They don't know who's involved in the sampling design. We just know that we have to follow the rules and have to pay farmers based on their calculations.
So the marketing board buys from farms, and then processors who make the products buy it from the marketing board at a set wholesale price?
Exactly. Now, there are exceptions, David. There are some provinces where they actually regulate the price of products at retail. Quebec is one of them. So Quebec will actually have a floor and a ceiling price for fluid milk. So every year they actually look at the price at farm gate, and they actually figure out what is a fair price for both consumers and the industry in order for everyone to make decent money while consumers have access to affordable milk. So lots of regulations, but at the end of the day, basically the whole idea is to continue to have some domestic production here in Canada, because overnight, I would say, because our farms are not very competitive, if you were to lift all quotas, if you are to eliminate the supply management system in Canada, chances are we would all start to drink and consume American milk and dairy products, because just our system is just not competitive at all.
Yeah, it seems rather complicated way to have the government manage the particulars of a supply chain. How long have we been doing it this way? And why did we start doing it this way? And what is the purpose?
Yeah, so for dairy, it all started back in 1972, and actually, in 1972, we were producing too much milk. We were dumping milk all over the place, and farmers weren't getting a good price. So in 1972, they decided to go ahead and implement this quota system. They gave quotas to 42,000 dairy farms across the country for free. They didn't pay for it. And over time, these quotas did gain some value because of how precious they became. So it was very regulated, and barriers of entry were very high. So in order to actually become a dairy farmer, you had to buy quotas essentially, and over time it gained value. So we had 42 dairy farmers, and in 1972 the intent was to protect these farms. But the reality, David, is completely different. Now today we are down to 9,500 dairy farms, and if we continue on the path we're on right now, I would say by 2030, according to some of our calculations, we should be down to 5,000 dairy farms. Trump or no Trump, it doesn't matter. It's really how the sector is designed, how the regime is designed.
So why is it that Canadian farms would not be able to compete with American farms if we didn't have those tariffs on American milk, for example, coming up here and being sold to the Canadian market? What's the difference between how they make milk in America and how they make it here?
That's a very good question, David. I think the answer is in part related to how the CDC, the Canadian Dairy Commission, calculates how farmers should be compensated. Because over time, we do feel that I think most Canadians want farmers to make a good living. But if you compare industrial milk prices and butterfat prices with the US, our prices are basically triple of what they are in the US. And so, and of course, during these surveys, they bring in all sorts of costs. And of course, it is more expensive to produce milk in Canada. For example, we have to heat barns in Canada. And when you heat barns, it means that it's colder, the environment is colder. And of course, animals tend to eat more to burn calories. And so all of these things tend to cost more. And that's why the cost of production in Canada is typically higher. So you're expecting industrial milk prices to be higher than in the US. but not 3 times. But all of these things have actually flown under the radar. People don't notice these things until, well, we start talking about Donald Trump and trades and things like that. And people are starting to wonder, okay, why do we have this system in the first place? And how much is this costing to Canadians? And it's costing them a lot.
So Americans are paying less for dairy than we are.
Now that's another. So you're talking about consumer prices. It's not a cut and dry thing. So the one legacy that supply management provides us is the fact that we have stable prices in Canada. So sometimes you'll have the dairy farmers of Canada say, well, milk in Canada is cheaper, or dairy products are cheaper, because they tend to look at American prices and they go through cycles. So sometimes dairy prices in the US are lower than ours, and sometimes they're higher than ours. For example, right now, egg prices are much higher than in Canada because of the avian flu. But typically, historically, they're always lower. So if you play with numbers, you'll get the answer you want. But generally speaking, in Canada, our dairy products, and this is just generally speaking, our dairy products are typically more expensive than in the US, but not always.
Is there any difference in terms of the quality, what goes into the finished dairy products or anything?
Yeah, so this is the other argument that is often put forward by the dairy farmers of Canada. They say, well, in the US they use growth hormones; they're not allowed in Canada, which is true. But very few dairy farmers in the US actually do use growth hormones, and that milk is not necessarily always intended for the human chain. It's for animal feed and things like that. So that's one. Two, with supply management, it is essentially, David, a self-regulated industry when it comes to product quality. So a few years ago, we discovered that many dairy farmers in Canada are using palmite, which is a palm oil derivative, to feed to cows because they want more butter fat out of their cows, because the money is in butter fat, not necessarily fluid milk, because Canadians are drinking less milk per capita every single year. The problem with that practice is that it made butter fat harder at room temperature. So if you've noticed, or if any of your listeners have noticed that your butter is harder at room temperature, that's because of the level of palmitic acid in the butter and how cows are fed. But we don't know for sure exactly how many cows are fed with palmitic acids, because everything is regulated by the industry itself. There's just no transparency.
Yeah, I go back to my comment that it does seem complicated. I think that's fair to say. You've got the commission in Ottawa, that's federal, and then each individual province has its own marketing board. The rules are all different depending on what province you're in. So I can understand how all of this is classified as a trade irritant for the United States, where they tend to be more pro-free market, less government interventionism, and less regulation. So coming back to the Donald Trump part of supply management, over the course of the last number of weeks, both the federal Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly and the federal Trade Minister Mary Ng have said supply management will not be up for negotiation in the face of Trump's tariff threats. They say everything's on the table, but apparently supply management is not part of the everything that's on the table. So what do you think of that decision or that position?
So first of all, I do believe that President Trump doesn't care about supply management. He cares about market access. I think the whole issue of supply management is more important for us, dealing with interprovincial trade barriers. If you truly understand how supply management works, with the quota system being managed by provinces, you quickly realize that in order to actually make Canada a free-flowing, open market between provinces, you can't do it without addressing supply management. And Minister Anand and Ning both said, well, supply management is off the table. We're not going to touch anything. Well, if you want to address barriers internally, domestically, you can't avoid supply management, because right now there are several restrictions, and each province, each region will have certain set of rules around dairy production, dairy distribution, dairy labeling, quality management as well. So those are things like, for example, we talked about surpluses. Well, in some provinces, they do manage inventories very, very carefully, and they don't hesitate to call certain farmers to dump thousands and thousands of liters. None of this is disclosed at all, and so you'll find different practices in different regions, and all these boards are very careful not to let go of all the power that they have. But if you are to say, if you are to deregulate or ease the commerce in beef or in wine, these sectors will always go back to the government and say, okay, we're willing to compete. We're willing to open up our doors to products from other provinces. But what about supply management? And that's why we've been dealing with interprovincial trade barriers for decades. That's why nothing is moving. This is why you need to put supply management on the table in order to make Canada a better um, a better um, a better player internally, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, market access, to go back and I think clarify how I've been framing this, Donald Trump and the Americans, their irritation is with the high tariffs that Canada has on imported dairy. If an American farmer wants to sell milk into Canada, it's charged those high tariffs. You mentioned, in some cases, 300% tariffs. Obviously, you cannot work around that. Nobody's going to buy your product if it's subject to a 300% surcharge on its way into the country.
That's right.
Would there be a way to address that concern without dismantling supply management as it exists?
Progressively, I would say. I mean, we a couple of years ago with Leadership Guelph, we actually outlined a roadmap. We called it a roadmap to supply management 2.0. I honestly don't think it's a good idea to dismantle supply management, especially for dairy. For eggs and poultry, it's a different story. These sectors are way more competitive. They're vertically integrated. They're connected with processing. They're connected with consumers. Not dairy. Dairy, it's all about production. And once the butter, fat, and milk are produced, they just sell and they move on. So there's no integration at all. So they're more vulnerable. I would say over time, you want to entice the industry to become more competitive. So, for example, I truly believe out of the 9,000 dairy farmers, some of them do want to compete. Some of them don't, but some do. So I think you need to get rid of those who don't want to compete by buying them out. We've been compensating dairy farmers. We've given them, I think, over $3 billion the last several years due to new trade deals in compensation, quote unquote. And instead of actually just buying peace and giving them money, why not buying them out and focus on those who do want to compete? And instead of having the CDC measuring how much farmers should be compensated for their work, why don't you use a benchmark of the top 25 best performing farms as a point of reference? So prices would drop, and slowly you would actually eliminate farms that just can't compete. And again, you buy them out. So progressively, say over 20 years, because you need time for that, you could actually eliminate farmers who just can't compete and focus on competitiveness. The problem with that, David, is that you can probably see where I'm going with this. Farms that are likely to survive are all going to be west of Toronto, up to Vancouver. East of Toronto, dairy farms are smaller, less competitive, smaller herds. So they wouldn't survive with a model like I'm suggesting.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of the overall landscape here, as these trade negotiations are going on, in the big scheme of things, how important do you think access to the Canadian dairy market is?
I don't think it's a big deal. It's more in principle, I would say. And frankly, I mean, we have to ask ourselves that question. I mean, are Canadians interested in buying American dairy products? I honestly, I think the majority aren't at all. So it's just more on principle than anything else. But I do think that there's little appetite politically to do anything with supply management domestically. I think it's fair to say that most politicians, if not all politicians, will not dare touch supply management because you have to understand it. I think you're smart enough to understand, David, that the dairy farmers of Canada is likely the most powerful lobby group in Canada by far. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of resources. Hundreds of people actually work for that lobby group. They know how to hurt people from a reputational perspective. So that's and politicians know that. Most politicians who say supply management is off the table will understand the political implications of doing something with supply management, but they don't necessarily understand the system itself. And that's why we've seen these compensations given to dairy farmers as a result of these trade pacts that we signed with Europe and North America and Asia. Because when you actually understand the system, farmers aren't losing money at all by allowing, because they just recalibrate quotas and they look at and they ask some dairy farmers to leave, to exit the industry altogether. So nobody's losing money, but they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from taxpayers' money. And that's when you see how powerful they are.
So that may be why it's a clever negotiating tactic for Mr. Trump. He knows that the actual dollar figure at the end of the day, when compared to other industries, steel, aluminum, car parts, what have you, access to the dairy market may not be that big a deal for American industry, but it is politically sensitive for Canada's political leader. So as long as he's talking about it, he's automatically putting them in a bit of a difficult situation.
We were a couple of senatorial votes away from seeing Bill 282 become law in Canada just a few months ago. Okay. And Bill C-282 would have actually granted immunity to supply management for any future trade talks, including USMCA 2.0. Can you imagine? Like, Parliament decided that it was okay to protect 1% of our economy and sacrifice the rest and prevent the 99% from having access to new market opportunities with China, UK, America, Mexico, and so on and so forth. That's how politically strong the dairy farmers are. It's incredible. I testified at Senate just before the holidays against 282 because I thought it was going to make supply management an even worse target, an even predominant target for Donald Trump. But he knows all of that. He knows that domestically this is really a sensitive issue, and he's going to tackle one at some point. Over the next several months, at some point, he's going to attack supply management. He's going to attack the integrity of supply management. So our best hope to see a supply management 2.0 comes from a non-Canadian, and that non-Canadian is Donald J. Trump.
Okay. Well, we will wait to see how often we hear the word supply management as these talks continue. Sounds like we may be hearing more about it as we get closer to that March deadline for those tariffs that Trump has threatened us with repeatedly now. That's our time for today, Professor. Thank you so much for coming back on the show to explain this for our listeners. I know it's complicated, a little bit dense, but it is important stuff, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have today.
Take care, David.
And again, that was the food professor, Sylvain Charlebois. He is the director of the Agrifood Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. We thank him for his time today. And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.